Welcome back to...
I was literally just like scratching my nose watching you.
Welcome back to Odds of War. We're back with another video. We're doing a little tactical talk. We're calling it Better Your Odds.
How to better your odds in the deployment phase.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, deployment phase. It's
Yeah.
important. Sets up the whole game.
That's how this started. I kind of came up with some of my big, 3 questions about it that I'm going to ask you. Is that cool?
Okay, let's do it.
All right, awesome. Basically, just for summarizing, it's how do I choose a deployment zone? Which model do I start with, or kind of know which order to deploy in? And then, when would I know to be aggressive versus defensive?
Okay, yeah.
All right.
So before we get too far in, let me just say none of this is going to be hard and fast, right? The game is so nuanced with so many different missions, different kill teams, different variations thereof.
If you're learning still, like me, you want to kind of maybe just have some guidelines.
Yeah, all of these are more guideline-y, like you said, than they are hard and fast rules, but they're pretty applicable across everything, and you can use them to help inform you better. So number one then, huh?
So number one, so when the board is set out, is there sometimes a deployment zone that's going to be better than another one, or are they supposed to kind of be equal to the teams?
Just to touch on setting up your board really quick, I like to set up a board before we know what mission we're going to play. That way there's no clear I'll stack some stuff over here to make a better zone than another. And I try to make it not symmetrical, but roughly even, so sort of all areas of the board have a roughly equal amount of terrain to have on there. So that's just that.
Okay, so if you do that and then you pick the mission and the deployment zone does seem to be off, where there's a a clear
area, winner.
Yeah. What would that mostly maybe be terrain, or?
Yeah, so I would say it would probably mostly be terrain, maybe with a slight hint towards if you're playing an objective-based mission and where those objectives are, there might be a clear winner. A deployment zone that is a clear winner, if you're playing for a narrative game, you're playing just to have a good story, totally fine. That's totally okay, because that you can work that into the narrative of the game and have a cool,
you have the
cool moments. Right, exactly. Yeah. If you're looking for a balanced game, though, a more competitive, if you find that there is a clear winner in the deployment zones based on the terrain, talk with your opponent, shift around some of the terrain to make both sides a little more equal. If you have a zone that's got a clear winner based on terrain, well, it's a clear winner, and that leg up is going to be difficult to overcome for the other team.
So that is sort of something that you should kind of maybe look over and speak up if you are newer of a player to your opponent, and maybe kind of be like, hey man, I don't know if that's really fair. So if you have objectives on the board, you kind of want to look for there being terrain around the objectives if you're the defender, or if you are both trying to get the most objectives.
Yeah,
then you'd kind of scout out where the terrain would be that you'd feel like you'd want to kind of be able to use.
What I would say with that is what you have to look at is look at where the objectives are. And like you said, some missions are going to have a set defender and attacker. The defender usually will have the advantage on objectives, but if there's no clear defender or attacker, and what you want to do is look at where your objectives are. Sometimes they're in a set position. Sometimes the players have placed them. And look at which of your deployment zones is going to allow you the easiest access to those objectives. So things like difficult terrain or large walls that you might have to move around. These could be factors that if you have, for example, a slower army like a Death Guard army, they're more slow than other armies. They might not want deployment zone that has more difficult terrain in it, because that's going to only slow them down further. If you have the opportunity to pick your zone, you might also want to pick the zone that's going to not only maybe benefit you, but also hinder your opponent.
Yeah.
So in that same example, if you're facing a Death Guard player and there's a bunch of difficult terrain near one of the deployment zones, you take the other one, give them the difficult zone, and then now they either have to fight through with way less movement, or you know they're going to try to avoid it, so you know which ways they're going to be moving during the game.
Similarly to any kind of strategy game, you can't know exactly what your opponent's style is going to be, but at least in this game, just kind of the more you play and you get to know either certain opponents that you play against regularly or specific armies, that can then factor your own skill in deployment of which zone you're choosing. Is that what you would say?
Yeah, like a know your enemy sort of thing.
Yeah.
So if you know your opponent has some sort of tactic that allows them to circumvent some terrain, or they have, for example, there's the veteran specialist, and the veteran specialist tactic allows them to move before the game begins. And so, again, you might want to stick them with the side with difficult terrain, following our example there, just to sort of hem them in a bit and control that a bit. Whereas if they have the side where it's just open field, you can't really gauge where they're going to be going or things like that. And if you have an opponent that likes to play a very shooty list and sort of sit back and shoot you off the board, and you find that one of the terrain setups in a deployment zone really benefits them, then you want to take that one from them so that
right, so
they
don't
can't have
get
it.
the benefit. Like you said earlier to me, like you feel like you're kind of doing this, intense calculation sometimes, trying to factor in all the different things of both the team you have at the moment and who you're playing against and how it's set up. So again, like, not going to be a hard and fast thing.
Yeah,
but,
right. Practice makes perfect. That's the maxim of it. And nothing is going to beat practicing. Nothing's going to beat playing more games, learning your army better, and then knowing your regular opponents.
Right.
So to put a nice bow on it for that one,
Okay.
look for hindering terrain or helpful terrain.
Okay.
Let that factor into your decision. Know your army and know your opponent's army, what both like to do, and try to help your army with the deployment zone and hinder your opponent with their deployment zone. And then look at, if you have objectives, where they are on the field and which deployment zone is going to allow you the easiest access to them.
Okay. And make sure that you speak up about if you think it's fair or not. If you think it's a good, fair board.
If you think
and,
the board
you know,
is set up appropriately.
Yeah. All right, second question.
Number 2, what model to put out first?
Like, do you start with something that you're going to gauge how the other player, if they're going to be setting up offensively or defensively, and kind of start with a low-cost model so then you can kind of recorrect with your larger ones? Or how do you know when to sort of take the initiative and be like, I'm going to just put him out on the line?
So what I would say with that, the biggest factor is probably your model count in relation to the enemy kill team. You have high model count kill teams because you can go anywhere, and you have low model count kill teams because you can be anywhere from 3 models to 20 models.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Okay? Now, a 3 model kill team has no room to try to put their low point model out first. So lower count kill teams, I feel, opinion, maybe, if you disagree, let us know in the comments. I feel like lower count armies need to put their most powerful models out first. For example, a very high power shooting model should be one of your early drops to put it on the board to control a lane of fire, because your opponent is going to say, all right, well, now that that's on the table, I have the choice of either placing my models within its threat range and line of sight, or outside of its line of sight and threat range. If they go inside, obviously now great, beautiful, you get to shoot at them. If they go outside, you go, okay, cool, they're scared of my model, I can leverage that.
Oh, okay.
Okay. For higher model count armies, though, you can actually do the opposite, where you go, all right, I'm going to place this small model that I don't care about, that basically tells you nothing. And now you have to keep essentially blindly deploying. Once all your scary stuff is out, now I can put my scary stuff out of range and line of sight of your scary stuff, but for in a beneficial manner for me to shoot. So you sort of have like a two sort of prevailing thought patterns there. Either get out your big, high power, scary things first, or hold them for last, as late as possible, to counter deploy against your opponent. The only other thing I would say really factors into that is whether or not you are placing the first model on the board. So one player obviously is going to get the first model on the board, and then the other player is going to place their first model, which is the second overall model on the board, okay? So that player who gets to place their first model has a distinct advantage in that they can, if they have that first opportunity to place a high power model,
They kinda,
right?
yeah.
So they have that little edge up. Now, if you're...
Well, and again, this whole thing is like, obviously there's no perfect formula,
Right.
because then it wouldn't be a game.
Right.
Right? So, yeah.
Right. Now, if you have the second drop, right, so your opponent has deployed their first model and it's a big scary, then you lean more into the counter deploying, where you go, okay, well, I'm going to see what you do first, and then I'll go from there. To put a nice bow on it, essentially, you have to choose whether you're going to be proactive in your deployment or reactive in your deployment. If you want to be proactive in your deployment, then you're putting out your high power models first to try to force your opponent into playing your game. You're going to be reactive because your opponent has tried to be proactive, force you to play their game, so you're trying to escape their game plan and exert yours instead.
Okay. Well, that kind of flows into the last question of the aggressive versus defensive. Maybe to kind of broaden that in the sense of like, well, the kill team board is smaller compared to like a full 40K, where, you do kind of have the ability to get to your shooting range a little bit sooner, or have a better chance at charging in a little bit more effectively. So in terms of like, what would you say about that sort of the aggressive versus defensive, or more up towards like the front line, towards the back end of the board? Like, should you make more use of the space of the board that way, by being kind of like towards the end, because you can still kind of utilize the board? Or do you just kind of want to get up in just behind terrain, or closest to the action?
Yeah, absolutely. So what I would say maybe the biggest factor in an aggressive deployment versus a defensive deployment is, how is your mission scored? If a mission is scored with objectives, there's two divergence there. There's a progressive scoring of objectives, and then there's a scoring of objectives that you hold at the end of the game.
Right,
okay? And then outside of objectives, there are kill point missions. And then there are missions that blend both of them. Okay? For a end of game objective scored mission and a kill point mission, I like to deploy more defensively. And for a progressively scored objective-based mission, I like to deploy more aggressively. So just to talk about that one really quick.
You can rack up your points faster.
Yes, you can get out of your deployment zone faster, and you can get those early points, which can be very decisive at the end of the game when it's, let's say, turn 1 and you get 2 points and your opponent gets none. Those 2 points can mean the difference between victory and defeat at the end. Now, at the other types of mission, the kill points missions and the end of game scored missions, I find it's more valuable to deploy defensively, because those early turns are not going to be as important for scoring, because ultimately every game is won by scoring the points as defined by the mission, not by killing your opponent only, unless, of course, that is the mission. So those early turns are not going to be as important, and it's more important then to prioritize survival so that in the later turns, 3, 4, and 5, potentially 6. 5 and 6 are variable, but 3 and 4, and then 5, 6 variable, to be able to then, with most of your force still intact, push out and take those objectives. The other thing I would say, of course, again, look at your two armies. If you are facing a very highly melee-based army, deploy more defensively because you want to keep them off of you as much as possible. Versus if you are the very melee-focused army, deploy more aggressively because that's the only way you're going to get value.
There, yeah, that you'll even potentially get into combat before somebody just
shoots you off the board. Yeah. One other bonus for the aggressive defensive deployment. With the advent of Kill Team Elites now, all sorts of models can go into reserve. And what that means is that they are deployed off the board, and then at the end of any movement phase can come onto the board. And then for a single command point, they can show up on any board edge as long as they're outside of 5 inches from any enemy models and within an inch of the board edge. So if your opponent is going to use reserves, then you want to make sure to keep a couple potentially low-cost models around your, like outside, around your more expensive models that you want to protect, to push away their models coming in from reserve.
Okay.
That's really important.
Yeah. So
that's
that
really
kind of
important.
adds like a whole nother.
It's a whole nother level. Yeah.
Well, cool. All right. I think that's that's like a good place to start with doing better with deployment. Do you have anything coming off your mind?
Yeah. I would say we pretty well covered it. The only thing I will say, the biggest mistake that I see a lot of people make is being too conservative in their deployment, okay? A lot of Kill Team players are from 40K, like full 40K. And in full 40K, you have to deploy defensively because your opponent is going to shoot you and charge you before you ever even get to move. Whereas in Kill Team, both teams are going to get to move before anyone fires a single shot. All right, this is super important because this allows you to actually place your models out in the open, out in the middle of nowhere, because what you're actually thinking about is, where do I want to be at the end of turn 1 movement phase?
Okay.
So when let's say there's a piece of terrain in the middle of the board, you can place a model at the front of your deployment zone with no cover whatsoever, because you know that they're going to move or maybe advance up to that terrain piece during turn 1 movement phase. So it lets you go there.
So that's kind of like a big, important mental shift.
Just to
one more wrap up.
Yeah, one more wrap up, a summation. Which deployment zone should I choose? Look for helpful and hindering terrain. Look for where your objectives are, and look for what zone will help your army succeed in its plan and hinder your opponent in theirs. Which model should I start with? 2 prevailing thoughts. Being proactive, starting with your high power, high cost units to force your opponent to play your game.
Which, especially if you have a low model count army.
Yes.
Okay.
Or be reactive and place your low cost models first to try to suss out where your opponent is going with their big models.
Okay.
And then 3, should I deploy aggressively or defensively? Depends on the mission. For progressively scored objective-based missions, deploy more aggressively. If you're a melee-based kill team, more aggressively.
Get up in there.
Yeah, if it's a end of game scoring mission or a kill points mission, deploy more defensively and prioritize survival.
Cool.
There you go. That's it. We hope these tips helped you. We certainly, it was quite a little brain tingler, sort of trying to jot it all down. If you like this sort of video, please let us know in the comments and give us a thumbs up if you liked it. And of course, subscribe to see more videos like these every week here on Odds of War. And we'll see you on the next one.
Bye.
Bye.